Okay, so this is all about boundaries, borders, and shapes of state. So now that you understand some of your basic definitions of what is a state, what is a nation, we're going to talk about how those states become states. What are the actual boundary lines that are created to give a state its boundary or its governmental ordinance on Earth's surface, right? So there's going to be four types of boundaries you guys will be responsible for in regards to how they are created. And then we're going to talk about the actual type in just a minute. The first is called an antecedent boundary. Antecedent boundary is a boundary line that was given shape before it was populated. So before people settled in a region, before there was inhabitants of an area, a boundary line was actually drawn. In your book, they talk about the 49th parallel being an example of the boundary line, where again, this US-Canadian border was already drawn prior to people living in that region. A subsequent boundary line then is the opposite. It was given shape after there was population already settled in the region. Now, a subsequent boundary line is really unique in the fact that it took some sort of social, cultural, or ethnic characteristic into mind when that boundary line was drawn, or potentially even religious in some cases. There are many different subsequent boundary lines that have been drawn in the 20th and 21st centuries in regards to such characteristics. A superimposed boundary line is similar to subsequent, but one really big difference. If subsequent was drawn after settlement with regards to culture, superimposed are not. Superimposed boundary lines were drawn after there was a population living in a region, but with no regards to ethnicity, with no regards to religion or culture or economic differences. Superimposed boundary lines are generally drawn by a more powerful group, and in a lot of cases can result in conflict. North Korea is a great example of this. North Korea also fits a different type of boundary, but in this case, in post-World War II, when the North Korean boundary line was really solidified between the communists and the non-communists of the region, it split families. There was no different ethnicity or characteristics between North and South Korea. And so that boundary line was drawn very politically for very specific reasons. The Berlin Conference is the same. The Berlin Conference, we know, 1884, 1885, when about 14 European countries came together and wanted to divide up the continent of Africa. And they did so then to profit their own country. This political fight for God, gold, and glory, as a means of imperializing a lot of areas in Africa. And doing so and creating a lot of those boundary lines, we've seen a lot of really unintended consequence and aftermath. Rwanda will be our big case study for superimposed boundary lines that were drawn by Belgium, by some colonial powers that really left boundary lines not respecting ethnicity in the region. And we'll talk about that a little bit later. The last type of boundary that is created is a relic boundary. It's generally a national border that did exist that no longer does today, but we can still see the remnants of that boundary line. These four are your four examples of creating boundaries. So then there are three specific types of boundaries that you will become familiar with and need to expert during this unit. One of them is a physical boundary. And a lot of times our physical boundaries, they coincide with significant features of the natural landscape. Whether it's a river or a mountain ridge, it's easily seen on a map. Even a desert can be an example. Why they create boundaries then is because in a lot of cases it's difficult to cross those boundary lines, which provides a pretty appropriate, in some cases a pretty easy boundary split between two different states. Some of our major rivers, some of our major mountain ranges and lakes are good examples of physical boundary lines separating two different states. A geometric boundary line generally follows a straight line. It generally has very little to do with cultural landscape, and instead uses some simple ideas like longitude and latitude. We can see North Korea as an example of a geometric boundary line divided at the 38th parallel, and then Canada, which we already kind of talked about today, the difference or the boundary line between Canada and the United States as well. And then the last one is cultural or ethnographic. These are very similar to subsequent boundary lines that are drawn or created as a means of a cultural divide. And trying to understand ethnography or the study of different cultures and why people live the way that they do, in a lot of cases provides us with a nice boundary line. Okay, so that is boundaries. Then what about disputes? Because there are always disputes over land and over boundaries. A definitional boundary dispute is one that is disputed because of legal languages. Maybe something in the treaty, the legal doctrine of the treaty itself. A locational boundary dispute is one that looks at the definition of the border, not being questioned, but instead the interpretation of that border is being called into attention. So, for example, a river, because rivers are being changed, we understand then that the shift in a boundary really brings into account the location of that actual boundary line. Operational really looks at the degree into who is operating that boundary. I think a good example of this would be the United States-Mexico boundary. And really how both countries need to agree on how to patrol the border in regards to how to handle it. And I think that operational boundary dispute is one that's pretty real. And then the last is an allocational boundary dispute, questioning the use of the actual boundary, whether it is Antarctica and trying to look at the use of the natural resources, or whether it's an ocean. We've recently, since the 1980s, had to create laws regarding the sea, and the maritime laws as to whose right is it to look at those natural resources in that area. Those are your different types of boundaries. Next, we'll look at states, which again are given its shape because of the boundaries they share.